Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
At my engagement dinner, I heard whispers behind my back that no bride should ever hear insults from my own family. But I smiled, raised my glass, and said nothing. I let them talk. Because I already knew what was coming. When my fiancé stood up to speak, their smug faces dropped. You see, I had a plan, a carefully crafted revenge for years of humiliation. And trust me, they never saw it coming. Hi everyone. My name is Claire, and I'm about to tell you the story of how my engagement dinner turned into a night my toxic family will never forget. It's a story of betrayal, secrets, and a little taste of cold, sweet revenge. So buckle up. I should have expected it. I really should have. If there's one thing I've learned after a lifetime with this family, it's that any moment of happiness I have will always be met with a sideways glance, a condescending smirk, or a passive-aggressive comment disguised as a joke. That night, the night of my engagement dinner, was no exception. Maybe I hoped they'd surprise me, just this once, with kindness or at least polite silence. But no, they never miss a chance to remind me that in their eyes, I'll never be good enough. Not for them. Not for anyone. And certainly not for Nathan. It was all so perfectly arranged, the kind of evening you'd see in a glossy bridal magazine. The warm amber glow of candles, the gentle clink of crystal glasses, soft piano music humming in the background, and guests dressed in their best evening wear. Everything looked flawless from the outside, exactly how I'd wanted it, elegant but intimate. Nathan had reserved the private dining area of a beautiful restaurant overlooking the river, with floor-to-ceiling windows casting a golden hue over the table as the sun began to dip low behind the city's skyline. It should have been one of the happiest nights of my life. And in a way, it still was, just not for the reasons anyone at that table thought. The moment I stepped into the room, I could feel the tension under all that polished surface. Aunt Julia's overly tight smile greeted me first, followed by the judgmental once-over she always gave me, her eyes scanning my dress, my hair, my shoes, silently looking for flaws she could file away to discuss with Lily later. Lily, of course, was already seated with her perfectly crossed legs and her signature bored expression, as if the whole affair was beneath her. She didn't even bother to stand up when I arrived, just raised her eyebrows and looked back down at her phone like I was an interruption in her otherwise important evening. Nathan, ever the gentleman, pulled out my chair and gave my hand a gentle squeeze beneath the table. I smiled at him, a real smile, not the fake one I had to plaster on for everyone else. He was the only person in that room who knew the truth. The only one who knew what was really going on beneath all the flowers and champagne toasts. And the only one who knew exactly how long I'd been waiting for this moment. As soon as I sat down, the whispers began. Not even discreet whispers, just low, careless voices, as if they weren't even trying to hide what they were saying. Aunt Julia leaned toward Lily with a forced chuckle, her voice clearly audible despite the background music. "He's way out of her league," she said, not bothering to lower her tone enough to keep it private. My ears burned, but I kept my face still, my expression calm, just slightly amused. That was always my strategy, never give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, my stomach twisted in a familiar knot. Lily smirked, that smug little smirk I've seen 1,000 times before, and replied in her usual dry voice, "Bet he's marrying her for money." The words landed like tiny daggers, not because they surprised me, but because they were so predictable. So typical. So petty. I stared straight ahead, pretending not to hear, even as their laughter followed a few seconds later, soft and cruel, like a private joke at my expense. I could have turned around. I could have called them out right there in front of everyone. But I didn't. I just reached for my champagne flute, lifted it slowly, and clinked it gently against Nathan's glass. I smiled again, wider this time, and nodded as if nothing had happened. Because I already knew something they didn't. Something they would never, in their wildest imaginations, see coming. Nathan squeezed my hand again under the table, his fingers warm and steady. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. We were in this together, and he knew exactly what those whispers meant to me. He knew the history, the years of being undermined, dismissed, talked over, and pushed aside. And more importantly, he knew what we'd planned for that evening. The truth was, that dinner was never just about celebrating our engagement. That dinner was a stage, one I'd carefully set, one we'd rehearsed behind the scenes, one that was about to host a very unexpected performance. You see, there's a certain kind of freedom that comes when you finally realize you have nothing left to prove. When you stop trying to win the approval of people who never really saw you. And in that freedom, there's power. Quiet, steady, unstoppable power. I had spent years biting my tongue, staying in my lane, nodding politely while they chipped away at my dignity. But no more. That version of me, the one they all thought they could laugh at, talk over, manipulate, she was gone. And as I sat there, letting them sip their wine and enjoy their little superiority complex, I felt something strange. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just a kind of anticipation. Because the moment was coming. The moment when the balance would finally tip, when the spotlight would shift, and all their smug little assumptions would turn to ash right in their mouths. They had no idea. Not a single clue. They thought they were in control. They thought I was the same quiet, forgettable Claire they'd always known, someone who was lucky to be in Nathan's orbit, someone who should just smile and be grateful. But they were wrong. So very, very wrong. And I couldn't wait to watch their faces when they realized just how wrong. There's a kind of exhaustion that settles deep in your bones when you've spent your entire life being measured against someone who was handed everything you had to fight for and still being told that you come up short. I don't think people truly understand what it does to a person when they're constantly treated like a placeholder in their own family, like a background character whose only purpose is to make the shining star look brighter by comparison. That shining star, in my case, was my cousin Lily, and trust me when I say that her glow came not from brilliance, but from constant, calculated spotlighting by Aunt Julia and the rest of our relatives who fed her ego like it was a sacred duty. I grew up in Lily's shadow, and not once did anyone stop to question how cold and lonely that shadow could feel. Lily was always thinner, always louder, always more glamorous in that fake, performative way that adults seem to adore. At family gatherings, I was the one in the corner with a book, while she was in the center of the room, laughing just a bit too loudly at things that weren't really funny. Every time I dared to speak, someone would politely smile and steer the conversation back to Lily. It was like I didn't exist unless I was serving some purpose for her narrative, the quiet cousin, the average one, the one they all felt comfortable dismissing. I still remember my high school graduation like it was yesterday. I had worked so hard for that moment, earned a full scholarship through sleepless nights and sheer determination, and when I walked across that stage, I felt proud. But that pride didn't survive the family dinner that followed. My mother's first words were, "Well, Lily got into her dream school early decision." Isn't that incredible? As if my achievement only mattered in the context of how it measured up to Lily's. I laughed awkwardly, nodded, and swallowed the bitterness like I always did, like I was trained to do. Even as I moved through adulthood, the comparisons never stopped. I got my first job at a reputable company, worked hard, and even got promoted within the first year. But when I told my family, the response was tepid at best. Aunt Julia raised one disinterested eyebrow and said, "Well, Lily's firm is more prestigious, isn't it?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake them and ask, why does everything I do have to be weighed against her? But instead, I smiled politely and stayed quiet, because that's what was expected of me. What stung the most wasn't just Aunt Julia's cruelty or Lily's smug superiority, it was my own mother's silence. I think that's what cut deepest. She was supposed to be my advocate, my protector, the one person who'd stand up for me even when no one else would. But time after time, she chose to look the other way. She let the comments slide. She let them diminish me in her presence and never once pushed back. She would later say things like, "Don't take it personally," or, "You know how Julia is," but that's the thing I did know. And she did too. But she chose to stay out of it, and her absence was louder than any insult Aunt Julia could ever hurl. Eventually, I learned to play my role, the invisible one. I kept my head down, stayed out of the drama, pretended I didn't hear the passive-aggressive digs that slipped into conversations like poison darts. I even convinced myself that maybe it was better this way. Maybe if I just worked hard and stayed humble, they'd eventually see my worth. But they never did. People like Aunt Julia don't respect quiet dignity. They see it as weakness. And Lily? She thrived on the imbalance, the unspoken agreement that her successes would always be celebrated while mine would be politely ignored. So when Nathan came into my life, kind, grounded, brilliant Nathan, it felt like the universe had finally handed me something purely good. He saw me, really saw me, in a way no one else had. He listened without judgment when I told him about my childhood, about the years of subtle emotional warfare disguised as family tradition. He didn't flinch when I told him that I felt like I'd spent most of my life as an afterthought in my own story. He just held my hand and told me I deserved better, not just from my family, but from myself. When he proposed, I said yes with my whole heart, not just because I loved him, which I truly do, but because I knew that this moment could finally be mine. A moment where I wasn't second best, where I didn't have to smile through someone else's spotlight. But there was more to it than just romance. There was justice, a kind of poetic, overdue justice that had been simmering inside me for years, quietly building strength in the background while I played the role of the agreeable underdog. I told Nathan everything. I told him about the insults, the comparisons, the way my family made me feel like nothing more than a footnote. And when I looked him in the eye and said, "I want one night where I take the power back, just once," he didn't hesitate. He smiled, took my hand, and said, "Then let's make it unforgettable." That was the moment everything shifted. That was the moment I stopped waiting for their approval and started writing my own narrative. This engagement dinner wasn't just a celebration of love, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And for the first time in my life, I was no longer the background character. I was the one holding the pen. There's a special kind of satisfaction that comes from quietly preparing a storm while everyone around you basks in the false security of their own superiority, never realizing how close they are to being swept away by it. That was the feeling that carried me through the days leading up to our engagement dinner, a slow-burning anticipation mixed with the cold, meticulous thrill of planning every detail, every word, every carefully chosen moment. Nathan and I weren't just organizing a dinner to celebrate our upcoming marriage. We were orchestrating a turning point, a calculated unveiling, a perfectly dressed event hiding a ticking clock beneath fine linens and floral centerpieces. From the beginning, we knew that the only way it would work was if everything appeared traditional and familiar, nothing too out of the ordinary to raise suspicion. The restaurant was chosen not just for its elegance, but for its layout, a semi-private dining room with excellent acoustics and just enough intimacy to make everyone feel comfortable, which was precisely what we wanted. The guest list was curated with deliberate precision, ensuring that every key player was present. Aunt Julia, of course, along with her ever-entitled daughter Lily, and the usual orbit of extended family who had always been more audience than ally. We even let Aunt Julia believe she had a hand in selecting the guest list, letting her feel that she was, as always, in control of the narrative. That, in itself, was an essential part of the plan. People like Julia thrive on a sense of superiority, and nothing fuels her self-importance more than believing others rely on her decisions. So we gave her the illusion, nodded along when she insisted on inviting her bridge club friends, agreed when she pushed to include a few of her acquaintances from the local charity board. The more she felt involved, the less she suspected anything was amiss, and the more confident she became in her own perceived authority over the event. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Nathan and I worked like architects of a well-timed collapse. He spent hours crafting a speech that would begin innocuously, a light-hearted introduction full of humor and gratitude, exactly the kind of thing people expect from a fiancé at an engagement dinner. The first half would be textbook, charming anecdotes about our first date, jokes about my inability to cook pasta properly, warm acknowledgments of our families. But then, carefully and deliberately, the tone would shift, Not abruptly, but with the kind of subtle gravity that draws attention like a sudden drop in temperature in an otherwise pleasant room. The final segment of his speech would hold the real payload, not just words, but proof. Evidence. Receipts that I had spent years collecting quietly, patiently, knowing deep down that one day I'd stop playing the role of the silent observer and finally step forward as the author of my own story. There were recordings, emails, screenshots, things most people would have discarded or forgotten. But I kept them. Not out of spite, not at first, but out of self-preservation. Out of that deep, gnawing feeling that I would one day need to defend myself against the narrative others had written for me. The recordings were particularly damning. Some taken during family dinners when they thought I wasn't listening, others captured in those moments when their guard was down, when their true opinions spilled out like venom over wine and dessert. Aunt Julia's cruel jabs about me being unremarkable, her mocking laughter about my plain looks, Lily's smug bragging about sabotaging a job reference I'd once asked her for, every word etched in digital clarity, stored safely and securely, waiting for the right moment. And now, that moment was almost here. I spent nights going over the plan with Nathan, rehearsing our timing, reviewing the flow of the evening, down to the moment when the first recording would be played. He never once doubted me, never questioned whether it was too much. Instead, he listened carefully, offered thoughtful feedback, and reminded me over and over again that I had every right to defend myself, not with rage or pettiness, but with truth. Cold, undeniable truth that no amount of smug smiles or polite laughter could cover up. There was something deeply empowering about being able to control the narrative for once in my life, to take back the pen that had so often been used by others to scribble over my worth. This wasn't about revenge for the sake of revenge. It was about clarity, about holding a mirror to the people who had always believed they could say whatever they wanted without consequence, because the target of their cruelty never fought back. Nathan even arranged for a few subtle technical reinforcements, a discreet speaker system to ensure the recordings would be audible to everyone, and a trusted friend who would help manage the transitions if anything went awry. No one would see it coming, not with the warm lighting, the fine wine, and the handwritten menus printed with gold foil. Everything looked perfect on the surface, just the way they liked it, which made it the ideal cover for the reckoning that waited beneath it all. I sometimes wondered in the quiet hours before the dinner whether I was doing the right thing, whether it was too theatrical or too pointed. But then I'd remember all the times I'd sat in silence while people who claimed to love me tore me apart with sugar-coated insults. I'd remember the birthdays overshadowed by Lily's drama, the holidays turned bitter with backhanded compliments, the way my mother always looked away when the conversation turned cruel. I'd remember the aching loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling invisible. And then I'd smile to myself, knowing that for the first time, I wasn't just waiting for kindness, I was making space for truth. They thought they knew me. They thought I'd stay quiet forever. But what they didn't know was that every moment they tried to diminish me, I was collecting bricks, and now I was building a platform they could never climb. The moment Nathan stood up from his chair, I could feel the shift in the air around us, a subtle tightening of breath among the guests, a sudden hush falling over the laughter and clinking cutlery that had filled the room just moments earlier. He placed his napkin gently on his plate, glanced around the table with that easy, unshakable confidence of his, and then reached down to hold my hand for a brief second, a quiet, grounding gesture that spoke more to me than any words could in that moment. I squeezed his fingers gently, a silent confirmation that we were ready, that everything we had prepared for was about to unfold exactly as planned. He cleared his throat softly, just enough to draw attention without seeming dramatic, and began with the kind of smooth, effortless charm that had made so many people underestimate him in the first place. "First of all," he said, his voice warm and light, "thank you all for being here tonight. It means a lot to Claire and me to have you here to share this moment with us." A few murmured responses of agreement rippled through the table, and several people nodded politely, their faces still lit with wine-induced cheerfulness. He followed with a few familiar, harmless stories, how we met at a bookstore when I accidentally knocked an entire shelf of travel guides onto his foot, how our first date involved me burning lasagna so badly the fire alarm went off, and how he'd quickly learned that my idea of a romantic dinner involved takeout and sweatpants rather than candlelight and string quartets. The guests chuckled, and even Aunt Julia managed a small, patronizing smile, perhaps comforted by the predictability of it all. I could see Lily roll her eyes behind her wine glass, already bored and clearly ready for the speech to be over so she could return to her endless scroll through social media. But then, almost imperceptibly, Nathan's tone shifted. His smile lingered for a second too long, and then slowly faded into a more serious expression as he let the silence stretch just a little longer than was comfortable. That was the first cue, the first crack in the smooth surface of the evening that signaled something was changing. He looked around the table, this time making deliberate eye contact with each person, and I saw the first flicker of confusion begin to surface in Aunt Julia's eyes. "There's something else I want to share tonight," Nathan said, and this time his voice was steady but lower, firmer, like a steady hand closing a door. "Something that I think needs to be said, not just for Claire's sake, but for the sake of truth." I saw Aunt Julia tilt her head ever so slightly, her practiced social smile freezing in place like a mask beginning to crack. Lily, on the other hand, leaned back in her chair with an amused smirk, clearly assuming he was about to announce something sentimental or overly dramatic. But then Nathan's next words dropped into the space between us like a stone in still water. "Actually," he said, his eyes still moving across the faces around the table, "there's something you all should know about Claire, and about this family." You could have heard a pin drop. The room, which just moments before had been buzzing with idle chatter and light laughter, now sat in complete stillness. I watched as Aunt Julia's lips pressed into a thin, cautious line, as if preparing to object before even knowing what was coming. My mother's face had gone pale already, her gaze flickering between Nathan and me with a nervous flicker that betrayed her sudden unease. Lily's smirk faltered slightly, though she tried to keep up her disinterested posture, clearly not yet grasping the gravity of what was about to unfold. Without another word, Nathan reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone, calm, deliberate, unhurried. He tapped a few times on the screen, and then, with a quiet confidence that almost made my heart stop, he placed the phone on the table, angled slightly toward the center, and pressed play. At first, there was just silence, a momentary pause as the recording buffered, and then came the unmistakable sound of Aunt Julia's voice, sharp and distinct, dripping with that familiar, biting condescension that had haunted me for years. Honestly, the recording began, her tone unmistakably dismissive. "Claire is just so plain. I don't know how she expects to keep a man like Nathan. Maybe he's one of those men who likes a charity project." Gasps broke out around the table, and I could see several heads turn sharply toward her. Aunt Julia's face contorted into a look of pure shock, her mouth opening slightly, then closing again like she couldn't decide whether to deny it or pretend it was a joke. But Nathan was already pressing play on the second clip, his expression calm, almost surgical in its precision. This time, it was Lily's voice, loud and clear. "Of course I didn't recommend her for the job," she said, laughing. "Why would I? She'd only embarrass me. I told the recruiter she was unmotivated and emotionally unstable. I mean, come on, it's Claire." The laughter that followed in the recording was her own, high and gleeful, and I watched as her face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. She sat completely frozen, her fingers clenched around her napkin, her earlier smirk now replaced with a mixture of rage and humiliation. And then came the third clip, the one that hit hardest of all. It was my mother's voice, unmistakably hers, giggling softly in the background of a conversation. "Well, you can't blame Julia," she said. "Claire has always been a bit of a disappointment. She just doesn't have that spark, you know? Some people are meant to shine, and others, well, they're just filler." The silence after that clip ended was heavier than anything I'd ever experienced in my life. I could feel the tension wrapping around the table like a storm cloud, the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressing down on everyone present. No one moved. No one spoke. Aunt Julia's fork clattered to her plate. Lily stared at Nathan like she didn't recognize him anymore. My mother looked like she was about to cry, but the tears weren't for me, they were for herself, for the mask that had finally slipped in front of everyone. And I just sat there, calm and composed, my eyes locked on the faces of the people who had spent years tearing me down in whispers and smirks, finally watching them choke on the weight of their own words. Just when the air in the room felt so heavy it could barely be breathed, and the shock of the recording still hung between every fork and crystal glass like thick smoke, Nathan straightened his posture again and calmly returned his phone to his pocket. But I knew, even before he said a word, that the most devastating part of the evening was still to come. What had already happened, the exposure, the truth, the unveiled cruelty of my so-called family, that had merely been the first strike. What was coming next would be the final blow, the part that would tear down the illusion of their superiority so thoroughly that there would be no room left to rebuild it. And the most satisfying part was that none of it had to be screamed or dramatized. All it needed was quiet precision, the kind that cuts deeper than noise ever could. Nathan reached inside his briefcase, something no one had even noticed he'd brought with him because it had been tucked discreetly beside his chair the entire time, and removed a folder so plain and professional that it immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room. People glanced at each other with uncertainty, wondering what he could possibly be doing now, after everything that had already unfolded. But he didn't keep them waiting. He opened the folder, took out a thick set of papers bound together neatly, and laid them gently on the table in front of him. Then he looked directly at Lily, whose face had regained some of its defiance, as though she had already begun constructing some internal narrative in which none of this truly mattered. That narrative was about to collapse. "I want to share one more thing before we finish dinner," Nathan said clearly, his tone polite but unmistakably firm. "Many of you know that I've recently launched a new business venture, a tech and consulting firm that has just secured a major partnership with a global brand." That statement alone brought a few startled expressions across the table, even from those who had previously seemed detached from the drama. After all, everyone loves to hear a little business gossip, and success always tends to command attention. Nathan continued without pause. "What most of you don't know," he said, carefully sliding the top page out of the stack, "is that Claire is not only my partner in life, she's also my partner in business." He held up the signed contract with our names printed side by side at the bottom, his signature and mine, side by side, in bold black ink. "She is the co-owner of this company. Her ideas, her strategy, and her brilliance are part of the very foundation of what we've built. And without her, it wouldn't exist." That single sentence sent another ripple through the room, one that didn't sound like shock anymore, but something closer to awe or perhaps unease. Because for years, they had painted me as the invisible one, the quiet one, the background filler to Lily's spotlight. And now they were being told, unmistakably and undeniably, that I was the driving force behind a company already being recognized on a global scale. The contrast was staggering, and I saw the realization dawn slowly in their eyes. But Nathan wasn't finished. He turned to Lily now, his expression composed but undeniably cold. "Lily," he said smoothly, "I believe you recently applied for a position with our firm." Her face went absolutely still, every muscle in her body suddenly locked in place, like she was bracing for impact. "Your resume came across my desk just last week," he added, his voice calm, almost too calm. "And I reviewed it personally. After careful consideration, I'm afraid we've decided to reject your application, and I wanted to make sure you heard it directly from me." The silence that followed was the loudest yet. I could see Lily's eyes fill with disbelief, then panic, and finally an almost comical kind of confusion, as though she couldn't quite process what she was hearing. Her lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time in years, she had nothing clever to say, no snide remark to toss in my direction, no superior smirk to shield herself. She had been bested, and there was nowhere left to run. Then, as if twisting the knife just slightly further, Nathan turned his attention to Aunt Julia, whose face had already turned an alarming shade of pale. "And as for you, Julia," he said, no longer bothering to hide the sharpness in his tone, You may want to check in with your board directors. The sponsorship deal your foundation was depending on? It's been rescinded as of this morning. Her eyes widened in horror as he added, turns out, your public image takes a hit when private comments like the ones we heard earlier become part of the public conversation. I'm sure your donors will be very interested in hearing what you really think behind closed doors. She looked like she was about to faint, her hand reaching instinctively for the edge of the table as if to keep herself upright. All her years of control, all her pride, all her sneering dominance, it was unraveling before her eyes. And the worst part, for her at least, was that she couldn't stop it. She couldn't spin it, couldn't talk her way out of it. Every word had already been spoken, every action documented, every bridge burning right there in front of her. I didn't say a word through all of it. I didn't need to. I simply picked up my champagne glass once more, raised it gently, and toasted to no one in particular, a gesture of calm celebration, not of triumph, but of closure. Because this wasn't about vengeance for me anymore. It was about liberation. About reclaiming the voice they tried so hard to suppress and showing them, without a single raised voice or ugly confrontation, that I had never been weak, just patient. And tonight, that patience had finally paid off. In the days that followed the dinner, a strange stillness settled around me, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind of silence that used to wrap itself around my childhood. No, this was a different kind of quiet. A peaceful hush that came with the knowledge that a heavy weight had finally been lifted from my shoulders after years of carrying it without ever fully understanding how much it had burdened me. Something had shifted irreversibly that night, not just in the way people looked at me, but in the way I looked at myself, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I had taken ownership of my own story, of my own identity, and of the voice I had kept buried for far too long under layers of self-doubt and forced humility. It didn't take long for the fallout to ripple through the rest of the family, and while I had anticipated some backlash, or at least a few desperate attempts at damage control, what came instead was a deafening silence from those who had always been the loudest in their criticisms. Aunt Julia, who had once made it her mission to dominate every room with her arrogance and superiority, suddenly stopped calling entirely, her voice and presence vanishing from my life like smoke after a fire. Perhaps it was shame, perhaps it was fear of further exposure, or perhaps she simply couldn't bear to face the reality of her carefully crafted image crumbling in front of the very people she had always sought to impress. Either way, her absence felt less like a loss and more like a relief. My mother, unsurprisingly, made a weak attempt to reach out a few days later, leaving a vague voicemail filled with half-formed apologies and hesitant justifications. Trying to sound remorseful without ever fully taking accountability for the years she spent enabling the very behavior that had hurt me most. She said things like, "I never meant for it to go that far, and you know I always wanted the best for you, but the truth is that wanting the best for someone means standing up for them when it matters, not sitting quietly while others tear them down." I didn't return her call. Instead, I sent a short message, letting her know that I needed space, probably for a very long time, and that I was no longer willing to play the role of the daughter who swallowed pain in silence just to keep the peace. Lily, of course, reacted in the most predictable way possible, by trying to salvage her reputation with a pathetic display of victimhood on social media, posting cryptic quotes about betrayal, loyalty, and fake people, all while pretending she hadn't been publicly exposed for the manipulative, self-serving person she truly was. But the internet, as it turns out, has a long memory, and within hours, screenshots of her cruel comments from the recordings had already begun circulating among our extended social circles. People who once fawned over her curated perfection were now questioning everything they thought they knew about her, and no amount of filtered selfies or inspirational captions could erase the truth that had been laid bare. Her attempts at sympathy fell flat, and for the first time, she had to face a version of the world where her actions had consequences. Meanwhile, my life, for once, began to unfold without the shadow of constant comparison, without the burden of proving myself to people who had never truly seen me. Nathan and I continued building the company we had dreamed about, and every day that passed was another step toward the future we had envisioned not just for ourselves, but for the kind of life we wanted to create. one defined by respect, partnership, and mutual support. It was more than a business venture. It was a symbol of everything I had fought to reclaim, a space where my ideas and contributions were valued, and where my name stood beside his not as a footnote, but as an equal. I poured myself into the work, not out of a need to prove anything anymore, but because it felt good to build something with my own hands and my own mind, something that belonged entirely to me. I discovered a kind of confidence I hadn't realized I was capable of, the kind that comes not from external praise, but from knowing, deep in your bones, that you've survived something hard and come out stronger on the other side. I stopped second-guessing myself in meetings, stopped shrinking in conversations, stopped apologizing for taking up space. For once, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving, fully and unapologetically. And perhaps most unexpectedly, I began to feel joy again, real, uncomplicated joy that came from the little things I'd once overlooked. Waking up without dread, walking into a room without the weight of judgment hanging over me, laughing without wondering if someone was laughing at me instead. It was a joy born not of perfection but of peace, of knowing that I had chosen myself after years of letting others dictate my worth. There are still moments when I think back to that dinner, when the memory flickers through my mind like a scene from a film I almost can't believe I lived through. But unlike before, those memories no longer sting, they empower. They remind me of everything I overcame, everything I reclaimed, and everything I refused to tolerate any longer. They are not scars, they are badges, proof that I didn't just survive a family that tried to shrink me. I grew despite them, and I grew bigger than their expectations could ever contain. So if you've ever felt like the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one dismissed as too soft or too simple to matter, I hope you remember this story. I hope you know that silence does not mean weakness, and that sometimes the calmest people carry the fiercest storms inside them. And when those storms finally rise, they do not just make noise, they change everything in their path. Because when you finally decide to speak, when you stop apologizing for existing and start demanding the respect you've always deserved, there is nothing more powerful. And the people who once whispered behind your back will be forced to listen, whether they like it or not.